Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most misunderstood, endlessly quoted, and strangely relevant men who ever lived. A man whose name became a synonym for ruthlessness, cunning, and political backstabbing. Even though the real story is far more complicated and far more human than any of that. Tonight, we're diving into the full life of Niccolò Machiavelli, diplomat, playwright, civil servant, political philosopher, and, depending on who you ask, either the first honest person ever to write about power, or the devil's secretary given human form. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. Florence, the city that made him. You were born on May 3rd, 1469, and already the world you've entered is complicated. Florence, Italy, your city, your cradle, your obsession for the rest of your life, is not the serene painting people imagine. It's loud, fragrant in all the wrong ways, and absolutely crackling with political electricity. Renaissance Florence is one of the most dazzling and dangerous places on the planet. Banks that stretch their fingers across Europe. Artists who paint ceilings that will make men weep 500 years from now. And underneath all that gilded magnificence, a power struggle so intense, so labyrinthine, and so deeply petty that it makes modern politics look like a school council meeting. Your father is Bernardo di Niccolò Machiavelli, a lawyer with more books than clients. He's not rich by Florentine standards, which means he's not rich by any standards that mattered in Florence. But he is educated. He keeps a personal library, which in the 1470s is roughly the Renaissance equivalent of having a second house. You grow up surrounded by the smell of old manuscripts, by the scratch of quill on parchment, by the weight of ideas written down by men long dead. Your father trades legal work for access to texts he cannot afford to buy outright, a pragmatic, slightly desperate arrangement that will prove to be the best thing that ever happens to you. Because what your family lacks in money, they make up for in books. And books, as you will one day prove, are where empires are made and unmade. Florence itself is governed nominally by a Republican council, but everyone knows who actually runs things. The Medici family, Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent because Renaissance Italians have a flair for branding, are the city's de facto rulers. Not kings, mind you. They hate that word. They are bankers, patrons, citizens, just tremendously, suffocatingly powerful citizens who also happen to control all the money, most of the art, and a substantial portion of the clergy. Lorenzo is brilliant, magnetic, and genuinely talented. He writes poetry that's actually good, which is not something you can say about most powerful men. He also understands, better than almost anyone alive, that power isn't just about force, it's about perception, about narrative, about making people feel as though they chose to love you. You are watching all of this as a child, and something in your young brain is filing it away. You grow up in the Oltrarno district of Florence, south of the Arno River, a neighbourhood less grand than the palaces to the north, but alive with craftsmen, minor nobles, and families like yours who are respectable without being spectacular. You attend school, learn Latin, study the ancient texts that your father is obsessed with. You read Livy, you read Thucydides, you read accounts of Roman republics, where citizens debated the fate of empires in public squares, where generals rose and fell based not just on battlefield results but on political skill, and where the difference between a great man and a dead man was often a matter of timing. You're not just reading these as homework, you're reading them as a map of something. You don't quite know what yet, but it feels important. It feels like truth in a way that Sunday sermons do not. By the time you're 15, Lorenzo de' Medici is at the height of his power, and Florence is buzzing with all the particular precarious energy of a city that knows it is the centre of the world and is slightly terrified of losing that status. The Medici Bank has branches from London to Lyons to Rome. The city's cloth merchants are rich enough to buy armies. The painters and sculptors working under Medici patronage, a young man named Leonardo da Vinci just left for Milan, and a teenager named Michelangelo has recently arrived at Lorenzo's garden school, are doing things with art that no one has done before. The humanist, scholars at the Platonic Academy are rediscovering classical texts and building a new philosophy of human possibility. It is, by any measure, a remarkable place to grow up, if you are a bookish, politically curious, observant young man with a father who has a library. You learn Greek, imperfectly but enough. You devour Cicero. You read the histories of Rome with a hunger that goes beyond academic interest. These are stories about republics, about citizens and armies and laws, about what makes a state strong and what causes it to crumble. You are building a mental database, though you don't know it yet, that you will spend the next 40 years populating and interrogating. What made Rome great? Why did the Republic give way to the Empire? What is the difference between a state founded on laws and a state founded on the personality of one man? These questions don't have answers in the books, or rather, the answers in the books contradict each other, which means the questions are alive, which means they're worth asking. You also, like every Florentine youth of your class and era, absorb the visual culture of your city in a way that is impossible to fully separate from your intellectual development. Florence is saturated with art. The churches are full of painted altarpieces and carved marble that treat biblical and classical subjects with an earthiness and humanity that is itself a philosophical statement. These are not remote divine figures, but recognizable humans in complicated situations, making choices with real consequences. The art of Florence in the 1480s is, at its core, about human agency, about people who act in the world and bear the consequences. You grow up seeing it on every corner, in every chapel. By the time you're 19, things begin to crack. In 1492, Lorenzo the Magnificent dies. He is 43 years old, and with him goes about 20 years' worth of masterfully maintained equilibrium. His son Piero takes over, and Piero is, how to put this charitably, not his father. The Florentines give him the nickname Piero the Unfortunate, and honestly, that's kinder than he deserved. Within 2 years, Piero makes a series of catastrophic decisions involving a French invasion and some territorial concessions that embarrass the entire city. Florence erupts, Piero flees into exile, and the Medici, those seemingly unmovable fixtures of Florentine life, are suddenly gone. Into the resulting chaos steps a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola, a man with burning eyes, a volcanic temper, and an absolute conviction that God is speaking directly through him. Savonarola declares Florence a republic under Christ's kingship. He preaches hellfire so vivid you can almost feel the heat. He sends gangs of children through the streets to collect vanities, mirrors, cosmetics, books of poetry, playing cards, anything beautiful or frivolous, and pile them into bonfires of the vanities in the public square. He has real, genuine power for about 4 years. He also has real, genuine enemies. By 1498, even the Pope has had enough. Savonarola is excommunicated, arrested, tortured, and burned in the same piazza where he once burned other people's things. The Florentines, a fickle audience at the best of times, Watch the whole thing with the grim fascination of people who cannot decide if they feel relieved or guilty. You are 29 years old when Savonarola goes up in smoke, and within weeks you get your first real job. Chapter 2. The Second Chancery, Learning to Play the Game. The new Florentine Republic, dusting itself off after years of Medici banking and Savonarolan preaching, needs administrators. Practical, educated men who can read Latin, write clearly, and handle diplomatic correspondence without accidentally starting a war. Someone, and we don't know exactly who, which is frustrating, recommends you for a position in the Second Chancery, the government office that handles foreign affairs and military matters. You are appointed in June of 1498. You have no prior diplomatic experience. You have no military background. You have no great family name to trade on. What you have are books, and attention, and a mind that has been quietly cataloguing the patterns of power for 2.5 decades. The job, on paper, is administrative. You write letters. You copy records. You organise documents. The kind of work that sounds deeply unglamorous, and in many ways is. But the Second Chancery sits at the intersection of everything. Every treaty negotiation, every military crisis, every diplomatic manoeuvre Florence undertakes, passes through offices like yours. You're not making policy, but you're watching policy being made. You're watching how Florence's elected leaders argue, bluster, compromise, and occasionally humiliate themselves in front of foreign emissaries. You're watching which arguments actually move people and which ones bounce off like pebbles off stone. You're taking notes, not always literally, but always mentally. Within months you're being sent on actual diplomatic missions, not the grand ones. Those go to more senior men from more important families. But the preliminary missions, the ones where someone needs to take the temperature of a foreign court, deliver a delicate message, feel out a potential alliance. These missions are educational in a way that no book can match. You travel. You sit across tables from powerful men and try to read them. You watch how they negotiate, how they bluff, how they reveal more than they intend to. You learn that most people in power are not as clever as they believe themselves to be, and that the ones who are genuinely clever tend to be the most dangerous. Your first significant assignment sends you to Catilina, the court of Catherine Sforza, a woman who has been holding her territory together through sheer force of will, while every powerful man in Italy tries to take it from her. Catherine is remarkable. She is tough, politically astute, and absolutely relentless in defending what's hers. She's also, by the time you meet her, under enormous pressure. You spend weeks at her court, trying to negotiate terms that will never materialize. But what you gain is something more valuable than a treaty. You gain a lesson in what it actually looks like when a ruler refuses to yield to circumstances that seem overwhelming. You also see, very clearly, what it looks like when fortuna, the wind of chance and circumstance, turns against a person despite everything they do. It's a lesson you'll return to for the rest of your life. Your reports back to Florence are detailed, precise, and reveal a quality that will define your career. You are a relentlessly honest observer. Not cruel, not cynical for its own sake, but honest. You write what you actually see, not what people want to hear. In a world where flattery is the professional currency of diplomatic correspondence, this makes you unusual. It also eventually makes you enemies. But before any of that, there is Cesare Borgia. Chapter 3. The Prince in the Flesh. Cesare Borgia. If you are going to understand Machiavelli, you need to understand Cesare Borgia. And if you are going to understand Cesare Borgia, you need to understand that he is one of those historical figures who seems almost too theatrical to have been real. He is the son of Pope Alexander VI. Yes, the Pope had a son, which tells you a great deal about Renaissance Catholicism. He is handsome, terrifying, brilliant, and absolutely without scruple in the service of his ambitions. He is in the process, in the early 1500s, of carving a personal kingdom out of central Italy through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriage, political assassination, and pure intimidating presence. He signs his letters Cesare Borgia di Francia, Duke Valentino, which is itself a kind of performance. 3 different identities crammed into one signature, none of them exactly who he was born to be. Florence sends you to Borgia's court in 1502, when Cesare is at the peak of his power. Your mission is to observe, report, and keep Florence out of the crosshairs of a man who has a documented habit of making rivals disappear. For 4 months, you follow Cesare Borgia around the Italian countryside, while he conducts a military campaign and manages multiple crises simultaneously with an eerie calm. You write letters home almost daily. Your dispatches from this period are some of the most vivid diplomatic correspondence of the entire Renaissance. You are fascinated. You are also, quite possibly, a little afraid. Cesare is a strange figure to be in a room with. He often holds audiences at night, either from personal preference or because the darkness is itself a kind of performance. It's harder to read a man's face when there's minimal light. He moves fast. He makes decisions without visible deliberation. He is charming and cold at the same time, the way that truly dangerous people often are, capable of warmth and generosity in one moment and utterly indifferent to human suffering in the next, and you are never quite sure which version will appear when the door opens. His soldiers are loyal to the point of devotion, which tells you he knows how to build that loyalty, and not only through fear. He pays them. He remembers their names. He appears among them without ceremony, in a way that most commanders of his status would never do. His political intelligence is extraordinary. He is simultaneously managing alliances with France, trying to neutralize the other Italian states before they can coordinate against him, handling internal discipline within his expanding territory, and keeping his father, Pope Alexander VI, both supportive and slightly off balance so that Cesare, not the Pope, is the one making the strategic decisions. The amount of active plate spinning involved is staggering, and he makes it look effortless. You watch him receive dispatches, absorb them, give instructions, receive more dispatches. He does not seem to sleep much. He does not seem to doubt much. Whether the certainty is real or performed, it produces the same effect. The people around him believe he knows what he's doing, which means they act as if he does, which means the belief becomes self-fulfilling. What you see in Cesare is something you've read about in Livy and Thucydides, but never witnessed firsthand. A leader who acts, who decides, who does not wait for perfect conditions, because perfect conditions never come. When 3 of his own commanders betray him, he invites them to a meeting at a town called Sinigaglia, under the pretense of reconciliation, and has them strangled. Swiftly, quietly, without public drama or prolonged cruelty. You write about this incident with what can only be described as cold admiration. Not because you enjoy cruelty. There's no evidence Machiavelli was sadistic in any personal way, but because you are watching a man who understands something you've been thinking about since childhood, that in politics, hesitation kills you, that the appearance of mercy can be more politically costly than a quick act of severity, that fortune favours the decisive. Borgia also makes a profound impression on you in a more unexpected way. He is visibly managing his image. He cultivates loyalty in his soldiers while terrorizing his enemies. He allows a subordinate, Ramiro de Orco, to pacify a newly conquered territory through ruthless methods, and then, when the population is sufficiently cowed, has Ramiro executed in the public square, his body left on display. The message to the people: yes, the cruelty happened, but your new lord did not want it. He has punished the man responsible. Come to me. I am just. This is political theatre of the most calculated kind, and you describe it with the tone of a man watching a virtuoso musician. You can see exactly how it works, and it works magnificently. Cesare Borgia will fall ultimately, not because he makes a mistake exactly, but because fortune abandons him with breathtaking completeness. His father dies. He falls ill at the same moment. The new pope is his family's enemy. Within a year of his peak, Borgia's empire is unravelling. Within a few more years, he is dead at 31, killed in a minor skirmish in Spain, which is about as anticlimactic an ending as you could imagine for such a towering figure. You will spend years afterward thinking about what his rise and fall means, what it tells us about the relationship between human skill, virtu, and the random, uncontrollable winds of circumstance, fortuna. You will never fully resolve it, but you will write a book about it. Chapter 4. Diplomacy, Marriage, and the Mechanics of the Republic. While you're watching Borgia and thinking enormous thoughts, you are also, it must be said, living a human life. In 1501 you marry Marietta Corsini, the daughter of a Florentine family of modest means. The marriage is, by the standards of the time, reasonably happy. Marietta is patient, practical, and long-suffering in ways that would exhaust a less sturdy person. You are frequently absent. You write her letters from your various postings, some of them genuinely affectionate, others a bit distracted, all of them revealing a man who genuinely cares about his home, even when he is physically incapable of remaining in it. You will have 6 children together. This is worth noting because the popular image of Machiavelli tends to be of a cold, cerebral creature without personal warmth, and that image is wrong. He is a man. He misses his family. He worries about money. He makes jokes in letters to friends. He is, in the most fundamental sense, recognizably, frustratingly human. The diplomatic missions continue, and they are educational in ways both intended and not. You spend extended periods at the courts of Louis XII of France and at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. France is an eye-opening experience. The French court is larger, richer, and more powerful than anything Florence can field, and the difference is not merely one of scale, it is one of structure. France is organized in a way that Florence is not. It has a professional military bureaucracy. It has a system for extracting and directing resources across a large territory, with a consistency that Florence, fractured by competing interests and merchant politics, cannot match. You make an observation at the French court that lodges itself permanently in your thinking. France is strong partly because it is unified. When you ask French advisors about Florence's political situation, about the factional struggles, the mercenary armies, the constant negotiation and renegotiation of political arrangements, they look at you with a polite condescension that stings precisely because it is not entirely unwarranted. From the outside, Florence looks like a city that cannot decide what it is, a republic that is not quite a republic, a merchant oligarchy that pretends to be a democracy, a city that talks endlessly about civic virtue while hiring other people's soldiers to do its fighting. You also note something else at the French court that will become one of your central themes. The French king, when he wants something done, can do it. He does not have to negotiate with 50 competing merchant families and a council of priors and a set of guild representatives who all have different interests. He decides, and the machinery of the state moves. This is efficient in ways that are genuinely admirable and terrifying in ways that are equally genuine. A king who decides badly moves his whole state in the wrong direction, but at least he moves. Florence, with all its complicated civic structures, sometimes cannot move at all. France has a real army, made up of French soldiers who fight for France, not mercenary companies who fight for whoever is currently paying. This is a structural weakness of Florence that drives you to distraction. You write about it, you argue about it, you eventually get a chance to do something about it. In 1506, you manage, through sustained lobbying and persuasion, to establish a citizen militia for Florence. Real Florentine men, trained and armed, loyal to the city rather than to a paycheck. It's not a massive army, but it's yours. It represents something you believe deeply, that a republic's military power must be rooted in the citizens themselves. People who have a stake in the outcome fight differently from hired hands. They fight, at least theoretically, because they believe in what they're defending. The militia is one of the genuine, practical achievements of your career, and you are enormously proud of it. You personally oversee aspects of its organization. You ride out to watch the training exercises. You write dispatches about its progress with the slightly anxious pride of someone who has staked their credibility on a new idea. The Florentines are not naturally soldiers, and turning merchants and craftsmen and farmers into a functional military force is harder than the Roman histories make it look. But you believe it is possible, and you believe it is necessary, and you push. The pride will later be complicated by what happens to that militia in battle, but we'll get to that. Meanwhile, Florence navigates the treacherous currents of early 16th century Italian politics with the grace of a man trying to cross a river on stepping stones that keep moving. The Italian peninsula is a patchwork of city-states, papal territories and kingdoms, all of which are increasingly being stepped on by much larger powers: France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire. The French invade, the Spanish push north. The Pope, whoever he happens to be this year, maneuvers for position. Florence tries to maintain alliances without committing too deeply to any of them, which is the diplomatic equivalent of trying to dance at a party where multiple feuding families are all watching and armed. You're in the middle of all of this, writing letters, making assessments, travelling thousands of miles on horseback through Italian countryside, watching the republic you serve struggle to survive in a world that increasingly seems designed to destroy small states and reward the merciless large ones. And you are thinking, always thinking, cataloguing, pattern matching against the historical texts you've been reading since childhood, asking the question that will define your intellectual life: what actually works? Not what should work according to moral philosophy, not what the church says should work, what actually, demonstrably, historically works when it comes to maintaining power and protecting states. This question will eventually get you into enormous trouble. Chapter 5. The Collapse. 1512 and everything after everything falls apart in 1512. The Italian political situation, which has been precarious for years, reaches a critical point. A coalition of Spanish and papal forces is bearing down on Florence. The Medici, who have been in exile for 18 years, see their moment. Florence's citizen militia, your militia, the one you fought so hard to build, is sent to defend the town of Prato. What happens there is brutal, fast, and completely demoralizing. The Spanish troops overwhelm the Florentine defenders. Prato is sacked. The news reaches Florence like a wave, and suddenly the Republic's will to resist simply collapses. The Medici walk back into Florence essentially unopposed. The Republic is dissolved. Piero Soderini, the gonfaloniere who has been Florence's effective head of state and your primary patron, flees into exile, and you are dismissed from your position with immediate effect. You are 43 years old. You have given 14 years of your life to the service of the Florentine Republic. You know more about the practical mechanics of diplomacy and government than almost anyone in the city. And now you have nothing. Your job is gone. Your income is gone. Your purpose is gone. What happens next is even worse. In early 1513, a plot against the Medici is uncovered. It's real. Two young Florentines genuinely are planning to assassinate Giuliano de' Medici. Your name appears on a list that one of the conspirators is carrying. It's probably nothing. A list of potential sympathizers, men who might be willing to support a restored republic, which at this point includes approximately half of Florence. But your name is on it. You are arrested. You are taken to the Bargello, Florence's infamous prison and judicial headquarters. You are tortured. The method used is the strappado. Your hands are tied behind your back. You are raised by that rope and then dropped. Repeatedly. It is designed to dislocate the shoulders and break the spirit. It is effective. You endure it multiple times. You do not confess. There is nothing to confess. You had nothing to do with the plot. You are held for several weeks. During this time, Pope Julius II dies and is succeeded by Giovanni de' Medici, who becomes Pope Leo X. This is the same Medici family currently running Florence, and their elevation to the papacy is a cause for citywide celebration. Prisoners are released as part of the general amnesty. You walk out of the Bargello with dislocated shoulders and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes not just from physical pain, but from the specific humiliation of being punished for something you didn't do by the same political machinery you served for over a decade. You go home. You go to your farm in Sant'Andrea in Percusina, a small village about 7 miles south of Florence, and you try to figure out what comes next. Chapter 6. Exile. The farm, the tavern, and the prince. The farm is not paradise. It is, by your own account in a letter to your friend Francesco Vettori, that has become one of the most famous pieces of personal correspondence in Western history, a modest and frequently aggravating place. You spend your mornings arguing with woodcutters over the price of timber. You walk the property in the pale morning light and argue with the landowners about rights and boundaries, the kind of tedious, grinding disputes that feel like an insult to a man who once negotiated with popes and kings. You set bird traps. Actually, literally, you describe setting traps for thrushes, the kind of activity that requires patience and produces very little of value, and that you do because it is something to do. You read, you walk, you think thoughts too large for the space you're in. You sit with the local men at the village tavern in the afternoon, men with whom you have nothing in common except proximity, playing cards, arguing about nothing, losing small amounts of money. You describe yourself falling into these card games with the specific despair of a man who knows he is wasting time, but cannot find a more dignified alternative. The locals are not intellectually stimulating company. You tolerate them. They probably wonder what this slightly intense, obviously educated man is doing losing at cards in their tavern. There are arguments. There are dice. There is wine of questionable quality. It is a long way from the courts of France and the tents of Cesare Borgia. But then evening comes. In the evenings you change your clothes. This detail from that same letter to Vettori has been quoted and analysed endlessly, and for good reason. You describe putting on your formal robes, the clothes of a courtier, a civil servant, a man who once moved through the corridors of power, and then you enter your study, and you open your books, and you converse with the ancient writers. You ask them questions about their lives, their actions, the logic of what they did, and they answer you, you say, in their humanity. And for those hours, you are not a disgraced bureaucrat rotting on a farm outside Florence. You are a student of everything. You are doing the most important work of your life. The ritual of changing clothes before entering the study deserves a moment of attention, because it is one of the most revealing gestures in the whole story of this man's life. He is not merely being eccentric. He is insisting, in the most tangible way available to him, on the difference between the degraded circumstances of his exile and the dignity of the intellectual work he is doing. When he puts on the robes, he is saying, "This matters. What I am about to do is not less real than the card game with the peasants. It is more real. It is the realest thing in my day. The formal clothes are not pretension. They are respect. They are his way of showing up properly for the most important conversations of his life, even when those conversations are with men dead for 1500 years. In this period, between 1513 and roughly 1520, you write at a pace that is almost alarming given your circumstances. You begin with what will become your most famous and most misunderstood work. You write it fast, the first draft in a matter of months. You call it De Principatibus, on principalities. We know it as The Prince. The Prince is 26 chapters long. It is addressed, in its dedication, to Lorenzo de' Medici, not Lorenzo the Magnificent, who has been dead for 20 years, but his grandson, the current Lorenzo. The dedication is partly sincere and partly strategic. You are not a wealthy man. You have no job. You have a family to feed. If the Medici would recognize your usefulness and give you a position, any position you make clear, you would be grateful. The Prince is, among other things, a job application, written in the form of a political manual for a prince. The irony is not lost on you, probably. You have spent years believing in republics, believing that citizens must defend their own city, believing that civic virtue is the only real foundation for political stability. And here you are, writing a manual for a prince, dedicating it to the family that destroyed the republic you loved. But you are also 53 years old and your family needs to eat, and you are not, despite what people will later say about you, the kind of man who lets perfect principles prevent him from surviving. What the prince actually says is something we'll return to in detail, because it deserves careful attention. But for now, understand this. You are writing in a specific moment, from a specific position, with a specific audience in mind. You are not writing an abstract philosophical treatise. You are writing as someone who has watched politics happen up close for 14 years, who has seen what works and what doesn't, who is frustrated by the gap between how political thinkers say power works and how power actually works. The Prince is your attempt to close that gap, to say, here is what I have observed, here is what the historical record demonstrates, here is the truth of it, whether or not the truth is pleasant. Alongside the Prince, you are writing the Discourses on Livy, a much longer, much more philosophically complex work that applies the same analytical method to the history of the Roman Republic. If the Prince is the quick, sharp, controversial work, the Discourses are the deep and considered one. They reveal something that later readers often miss about Machiavelli. He actually prefers republics to princedoms. He thinks republics are more stable, more adaptive, more capable of generating genuine civic virtue. The Discourses are a love letter to the Roman Republic's political genius, filtered through an Italian Renaissance brain that is desperately watching Italy fail to achieve anything of the kind. If the Prince is Machiavelli the realist, the Discourses are Machiavelli the idealist, and the two books together give you the full picture. He also, during this period, writes a military treatise, The Art of War, and begins work on the Florentine histories, and, in moments that must feel almost absurdly domestic, given the weight of what he's thinking, he writes comedies, actual stage comedies. The most famous is Mandragola, a sharply funny, morally complicated play about deception, desire, and the malleability of human virtue. It is, by every measure, excellent. It would be notable even if Machiavelli had written nothing else. The fact that the same person who wrote The Prince also wrote Mandragola tells you something important about who he actually was. Not a cold calculator, but a man who found human absurdity genuinely, delightedly funny. Chapter 7. The Prince. What he actually said. Let's talk about the book, because the Prince has been quoted, misquoted, weaponized, condemned, celebrated, and fundamentally misunderstood for 500 years, and it deserves a fair hearing. The first thing to understand is what Machiavelli is doing and why it is radical. Before the Prince, political philosophy in Europe is fundamentally concerned with what a ruler should be. The genre of the Mirror for Princes, advice books for rulers, is ancient and well established, and essentially all of these books say variations of the same thing. A good ruler should be just, pious, merciful, generous, truthful. These are Christian virtues applied to governance. The assumption is that if a ruler is personally virtuous, their state will flourish, because God rewards virtue. This is not cynicism. The people who write these books believe it sincerely. Machiavelli looks at the historical record and sees a different story. He sees repeatedly that personally virtuous rulers are frequently destroyed by personally ruthless ones. He sees that generosity, taken too far, drains a treasury and weakens a state. He sees that mercy, applied indiscriminately, is interpreted as weakness. He sees that the appearance of virtue is often more politically useful than actual virtue, because actual virtue constrains you and the appearance of virtue does not. He is not celebrating this. He is observing it. He is reporting what he sees, which is what honest observers do, and what almost nobody in the political philosophy tradition has been willing to do before him. And this is why, right from the opening pages of The Prince, you feel something different in the air. He doesn't ease into his argument. He lays it out with the directness of a man who has been holding this thought for a long time, and is done being polite about it. He says that he intends to discuss the effective truth of things, rather than their imagined truth. This single phrase, la verità effettuale della cosa, is one of the most consequential sentences in the history of Western thought. It is the founding statement of political realism. It says, I am not interested in how things ought to work. I am interested in how things work. And I will tell you what I have seen, not what you want to hear. The chapter on cruelty is the one that shocks people most. Machiavelli argues that cruelty used well, meaning used swiftly, decisively, and then stopped, is more humane than cruelty used poorly. A new ruler who hesitates, who is merciful at the wrong moment, who allows disorder to fester, that ruler produces more suffering in the long run than the ruler who acts sharply and clearly at the start and then allows peace to settle. He gives the example of Cesare Borgia's management of the Romagna, the very events you witnessed firsthand. The cruelty was real, but it produced stability, and stability for ordinary people is what matters. It is an argument that is morally uncomfortable and historically defensible, which is exactly the combination most likely to make people furious. There is also the much debated question of whether a prince should keep his word. Machiavelli's answer is that a prince who keeps his word in all circumstances, regardless of whether circumstances have changed or whether the original promise was obtained by deception, is a naive prince. He points out dryly that the most successful rulers in history have understood how to use both force and cunning. The lion and the fox, he says, borrowing an image from classical sources. The lion frightens wolves. The fox sees traps. You need both. A man who is only a lion, who relies entirely on direct force, and keeps every promise regardless of cost, will be outmaneuvered by those who are also foxes. This is not advice to be a liar. It is advice to understand that in a world where not everyone keeps promises, unilateral adherence to promise-keeping is a handicap, not a virtue. On the famous question of whether it is better to be loved or feared, Machiavelli says, ideally both. But if you must choose, fear is more reliable. Love is maintained by the governed. It depends on their disposition and can fail when circumstances change. Fear is maintained by the governor. It depends on your actions and can be reliably sustained. But, and this is crucial, and often left out when this passage is quoted, you must avoid being hated. Fear without hatred is sustainable. Fear with hatred is fatal. The people who hate you will destroy you the moment you weaken. The people who merely fear you will accept your rule as long as you are strong and leave their families and property alone. This is not nihilism. It is not advice to behave monstrously. It is a specific, calibrated argument about the mechanics of political survival. Machiavelli is trying to help rulers be effective, and his implicit assumption, buried under all the realism, is that effective rulers are better for their subjects than ineffective ones. An ineffective ruler who is personally pious and kind but cannot maintain order produces more suffering than an effective ruler who is strategically ruthless. He also writes extensively about arms, about the military foundations of any state. A prince without his own army, relying on mercenaries or auxiliary troops borrowed from allies, is building on sand. Mercenaries fight for money and have no deep interest in your survival. Borrowed troops belong to someone else's prince and can be recalled at any moment. Only an army that is yours, your own citizens, trained and loyal, provides real security. He is drawing directly on his experience with the Florentine militia, on his observations of French military organization, on his reading of Roman history. The military argument in The Prince is not an abstract recommendation. It is the distillation of everything he watched go wrong in Italian politics for 3 decades. He introduces the concept of fortuna and virtù, fortune and virtue, though virtue here means something closer to skill, energy, adaptability than the Christian moral sense. Fortune is the river that floods unpredictably. The skilled ruler is the one who builds embankments before the flood comes, so that when fortune turns against them, as it inevitably will, they have prepared. Cesare Borgia was not destroyed by a lack of skill. He was destroyed by a collapse of fortune so complete and so sudden, his father dying at the exact moment Borgia was himself incapacitated by illness, that no amount of preparation could have saved him. Machiavelli admires Borgia's methods even in describing his fall. He is clear-eyed enough to acknowledge that sometimes fortune simply wins. He argues famously that it is better to be bold than cautious, because fortune, which he compares to a river, and also, in a more charged metaphor, to a woman, responds better to boldness. This passage has drawn justified criticism for its gendered language. What Machiavelli means, stripped of the metaphor, is that passive caution in a dynamic environment is actually the more dangerous strategy. Waiting for perfect conditions is itself a choice, and often the worst one. The world does not stop while you deliberate. Your enemies do not pause. Fortune does not reward patience unless that patience is active, unless you are building, preparing, learning while you wait. The final chapter of The Prince, the exhortation to liberate Italy, is a sudden shift in register that catches many first-time readers off guard. For 25 chapters, Machiavelli has been analytical, controlled, clinical. He has been the precise observer describing what works and what doesn't. And then, in the final pages, the mask slips. He calls on whoever might read this book and have the power to act on it, clearly addressed, despite the futility to the Medici, to take up the cause of Italian liberation from foreign domination. He quotes Petrarch. He says, Italy has been waiting for a redeemer. He allows the emotion in, all at once, and it is genuine, and it is painful to read. Because you know, as you read it, that no such redeemer came. that Machiavelli died waiting, that Italy would wait another 3 centuries. The Prince is not a guide to evil. It is a guide to survival in a world that Machiavelli found through direct experience to be neither just nor gentle. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, you cannot read The Prince honestly and come away thinking you've met the devil. You've met someone who decided to tell the truth about power in a world where everyone else was still pretending. Chapter 8. Trying to come back. The Medici Years. The Prince circulates in manuscript form. It won't be published until after Machiavelli's death, and gets him some attention, but not the job he desperately needs. The Medici read it, possibly. Are impressed by it, perhaps. Give him a position? Not yet. Florence is now thoroughly Medician, and you are thoroughly associated with the old Republic, which is the political equivalent of wearing the wrong team's jersey to every Medici event. But you don't stop trying. You write to Vettori. You write to other friends with access to the Medici. You attend meetings of the Orti Auricellari, a discussion group of humanists and intellectuals that gathers in the gardens of the Russelli family and represents, in this period, about the most intellectually stimulating company Florence has to offer. Here you debate history, politics, military theory, and the lessons of Rome with men who take these questions as seriously as you do. Your discourses on Livy grow out of discussions held in this garden. It is, in the context of your exile and frustration, a genuine community, and you are clearly valued in it. The younger members look to you with something like reverence. You are the man who was there, who saw Cesare Borgia, who sat across tables from Louis XII, who built a militia and watched it march, who was in the Second Chancery when Florence was navigating the most complex political landscape in Europe, and who came away from all of it not embittered and broken, but full of ideas, full of observations, full of the particular energy of someone who has paid attention for a very long time and has things to say. You are not a bitter man warning the young about the cruelty of the world. You are an interested man who finds the world endlessly, almost unbearably interesting, even when it's grinding you down. You also write a play. Mandragola, possibly completed around 1518, is staged and becomes a genuine hit. Lorenzo de' Medici, whose favour you are still trying to court, apparently sees it and enjoys it. The play is about a young man who wants to sleep with a married woman and engineers an elaborate deception to achieve it, involving a fake doctor, a fake potion, and a spectacularly corrupt friar. It is funnier than it sounds. It is also a meditation on the same themes you explore in The Prince. The gap between appearance and reality, the willingness of people to believe what they want to believe, the flexibility of moral principles when desire or interest is involved. You find the same patterns in comic relationships that you find in political ones, because of course you do. You are Machiavelli. Everything connects. Slowly, almost painfully slowly, the ice begins to thaw. By 1520, the Medici commission you to write an official history of Florence, the Florentine Histories. It's not the diplomatic post you wanted, but it's something. It's income. It's legitimacy. It means they've decided you're useful, which is about as close to rehabilitation as you're going to get. You take the commission seriously. The Florentine Histories is a substantial work covering Florence from its origins through the late 15th century. It applies your characteristic analytical method to Florentine history, looking for patterns, for structural causes, for the ways in which institutions and individuals shape and are shaped by fortune. It is less dramatic than The Prince, but in many ways more mature. You are also given minor diplomatic missions during this period, nothing like the major postings of the old days, but enough to feel like you still have a role, enough to matter. And then, just as things are beginning to improve, the world shifts again. Chapter 9. The Larger World, Italy's Tragedy. To understand Machiavelli's political thought, you have to understand the tragedy that surrounds him throughout his adult life. Italy in the late 15th and early 16th centuries is not a unified nation. It is a collection of squabbling city-states: Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, the Papal States, Genoa, Ferrara, Mantua, each with its own interests, alliances, and army for hire. These states have maintained a kind of equilibrium through the Peace of Lodi, a 1454 agreement that created a balance of power among the major Italian powers. For 40 years, this equilibrium holds, more or less. Italy is not at peace. It's never quite at peace. But the conflicts are manageable, contained, mostly Italian. And then, in 1494, Charles VIII of France decides he has a claim to the Kingdom of Naples. He marches a French army across the Alps and down the Italian peninsula with a speed and decisiveness that stuns everyone. The Italian states scramble, negotiate, switch sides, beg, threaten, and mostly get out of the way. Charles takes Naples. Then he leaves. But something has broken. The French have demonstrated that Italy is vulnerable, that the great powers north of the Alps can simply decide to treat Italian territory as their arena. Spain, the Habsburgs, the papacy, they all take notice. Italy becomes, for the next 60 years, the principal battlefield of European great power competition. Machiavelli watches all of this with the specific despair of someone who sees the structural problem clearly but can do nothing about it. The Italian city-states cannot cooperate. They cannot form a unified military force. Their reliance on mercenaries means they have armies that are expensive, unreliable, and fundamentally not invested in the outcome of any specific conflict. Machiavelli argues repeatedly that Italy needs a prince, a single powerful leader who can unify the peninsula and drive out the foreign invaders, not because he loves tyranny, but because he looks at the situation and cannot see another option. A republic requires virtuous citizens. Italy's political culture, corroded by faction and self-interest, may not be capable of producing them. A single strong leader, however imperfect, might impose the order that civic virtue has failed to generate. This is the emotional core of the prince, and it's important not to miss it. The famous final chapter, chapter 26, the exhortation, is the most emotionally charged thing Machiavelli ever wrote. He calls on whoever might read his book and have the power to act on it to take up the cause of Italian liberation. He quotes Petrarch. He allows himself, just for a moment, to be openly, vulnerably hopeful. This is not the writing of a cold cynic. It is the writing of a man who loves his country and cannot bear watching it dismantled by foreign armies while its leaders squabble over petty advantages. The Italy he loves is not going to be saved. The French, the Spanish, the Germans, they will continue to treat the peninsula as their stage for another century. The dreams he has for Italian unity will not be realized for 350 years. He knows on some level that he is writing in the dark, but he writes anyway. Chapter 10. The plays, the poems, the whole man. There is a version of Machiavelli that gets taught in philosophy classes and political science seminars that is essentially a talking head attached to the prince, a mind that produces political insights and has no other qualities. This version is inadequate and slightly insulting to the actual person. Niccolò Machiavelli also loves carnival. He writes carnival songs, bawdy, cheerful, entirely unconcerned with the dignity expected of a serious political thinker. He loves wine, he loves women, perhaps more than is strictly compatible with being a faithful husband, and the letters between him and his friend Luigi Guicciardini contain accounts of certain romantic misadventures in the countryside that are funny, self-deprecating, and deeply, recognizably human. He jokes about his own bad luck. He writes to friends in a register that is warm, witty, and completely different from the crisp, analytical prose of his political works. He cares about the theatre. Mandragola is the masterpiece, but he writes other plays. Clesia is a later comedy, also excellent, also funnier than you'd expect. The comedies are performed. They are enjoyed by real audiences in real Florentine piazzas. Machiavelli stands in the crowd and watches people laugh at the situations he has constructed, and you can be certain he laughs along with them. He is not a gloomy man. He is a serious man who knows how to be unserious. He has close friends and maintains those friendships across decades of political upheaval, exile, and mutual frustration. Francesco Guicciardini, the great historian, the man who will write the most comprehensive history of Italy of the entire era, is one of his most important intellectual companions in the later years. They correspond extensively. They disagree about many things. Guicciardini is more cautious, more cynical in a genuinely personal way, more comfortable with the particolari, the specific advantages of specific situations, than with Machiavelli's tendency to draw grand historical lessons. Their correspondence is one of the great intellectual exchanges of the Renaissance. Two brilliant men who respect each other enormously and argue constantly. Machiavelli also has an affair, or several, in the years of his later life. The most documented is his attachment to a singer named Barbara Rafficani Salutati. She's a real person, talented and admired in Florentine musical circles. He writes poems for her. He is, by this point, in his 50s, which in the 16th century is genuinely old, and the relationship has about it the quality of a man who is not ready to stop feeling things. He is not trying to be dignified. He is trying to be alive. This is worth understanding, because it shapes how we read his political work. He is not writing from nowhere. He is writing from inside a life that has had genuine love in it, genuine friendship, genuine loss, genuine humiliation. When he talks about Fortuna and how it defeats even the most prepared and skillful person, he is not speaking abstractly. He has been thrown in prison and tortured for something he didn't do. He has watched his life's work dismantled overnight. He has felt fortune turn its back on him with a completeness that must have been devastating. The philosophy is personal. It's always personal. Chapter 11. The Final Years, So Close and Then Gone. By the mid-1520s, your rehabilitation, though incomplete, is real. You have the commission for the Florentine histories. You have minor diplomatic roles. You have your intellectual circle. You are not what you were before 1512, but you are not entirely nothing. And then, in 1526, something extraordinary happens. You are given a serious job. Pope Clement VII, a Medici naturally, appoints you as secretary to the magistracy overseeing Florentine military fortifications. It is not the Second Chancery. It is not what you once were, but it is real. It is important, and you throw yourself into it with the energy of a man who has been waiting 15 years for someone to ask. The reason the fortifications matter is that Italy is, once again, in crisis. Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, united now under Charles V, are the dominant force. France is pushing back. The Pope is manoeuvring. And in May 1527, the worst thing happens. Charles V's mercenary army, which includes both Spanish soldiers and Lutheran German Landsknechts, who hate the papacy with a religious fervour that makes their employers nervous, arrives outside Rome. The soldiers have not been paid. They are hungry, angry, and ideologically motivated in unpredictable directions. The Pope has failed to arrange a proper defence, and on May 6, 1527, the army sacks Rome. The sack of Rome is one of the most catastrophic events of the Italian Renaissance. Churches are looted, palaces are ransacked, clergy, cardinals, and ordinary Romans are treated with a brutality that shocks even contemporaries hardened by decades of Italian warfare. The Pope flees into the Castel Sant'Angelo. Scholars flee. Artists flee. The city that was the centre of Catholic Christendom is effectively destroyed in a matter of days by an army that, in theory, was serving the Holy Roman Emperor, who was himself theoretically a defender of the Church. It is a scene directly from the pages of political philosophy written by someone who argued that appearances rarely match reality. The news reaches Florence and produces its own political earthquake. The Medici, associated with the Pope and the losing side of the Italians, political crisis, are expelled from Florence. Again, the Republic is restored. Again, and for a moment, just a moment, it seems like the wheel of fortune might turn back in your favour. The Republic, your Republic, the thing you spent 14 years serving and lost everything for, it's back. But you are not the man you were in 1498. You are 58 years old, your health is uncertain, and the new Republic, staffed by men who have spent 15 years resenting the Medici, is not entirely sure what to make of you. You spent those 15 years trying to make peace with the Medici. You wrote The Prince, addressed to a Medici. You served Medici commissions. To the new Republican government, you are tainted. You are not their man. You are the man who tried to find a way to work with the enemy. They don't give you your old job back. They give it to someone else, someone more purely Republican, more reliably opposed to the Medici throughout. You have spent 15 years being too Republican for the Medici and too Medician for the Republicans, and now the pendulum has swung and you're on the wrong side of it once again. Fortune, which you have spent decades studying, refuses to be tamed, even by you. The blow is significant. It is not just the disappointment of not getting a job. It is the recognition that the political moment you've been waiting for has arrived, and it has arrived without you. You are not necessary, not indispensable. The Republic can manage without Niccolò Machiavelli, and if the Republic can manage without you, what exactly were all those years for? You fall ill. It's a stomach ailment, probably peritonitis, though the doctors of the day have neither the knowledge nor the tools to identify it properly. You are in physical pain, which compounds the other kind. You go home to your family. You try remedies, each of which fails to do anything useful. The illness progresses. On June 21st, 1527, Niccolò Machiavelli dies. He is 58 years old. He is buried in the Church of Santa Croce in Florence. His tomb is there still. Most visitors walk past it on their way to see Michelangelo's, a sculptor whose life overlapped with his, whose city was the same, whose world was the same, and whose name has become far more universally celebrated. But those who stop know what they're looking at. They know the name carved in that stone once belonged to a man who decided that the truth about power was more important than the comfort of everyone who preferred comfortable lies. Chapter 12. The Legacy, the most dangerous book in history. The Prince is published posthumously in 1532, 5 years after Machiavelli's death. It causes initially more curiosity than outrage. The first readers include diplomats, scholars, and politically active individuals who find in it a refreshingly honest account of things they had long suspected but never seen written down. There is a kind of relief in reading, something that confirms what your own experience has been suggesting. He is read and appreciated initially as someone who has simply had the nerve to say what everyone in politics already knew. But within a generation, the outrage catches up. The book is placed on the Catholic Church's Index of Prohibited Books in 1559. This is, depending on your perspective, either the most embarrassing mistake the Church made in an era full of mistakes, or a fairly predictable institutional response to a book that dismantles the theological foundations of political legitimacy. The Prince is dangerous not because it advocates evil, but because it asks readers to evaluate political actions by their results, rather than by their alignment with divine law. This is, in the 16th century, a genuinely subversive question. If you accept Machiavelli's framework, that political actions should be judged by whether they produce stability and protect the people, not by whether they conform to Christian moral teaching, then the Church's authority over political life is suddenly on shakier ground. That is why they banned it. Not because it made rulers cruel, but because it made rulers independent. The term Machiavellian enters the English language as an insult almost immediately. In Elizabethan drama, Shakespeare, Marlowe, the whole brilliant and chaotic explosion of English theatre in the late 16th century, the Machiavel is a stock villain, a scheming, manipulative figure without moral restraint. The character often appears on stage and announces directly to the audience that he is a follower of Machiavelli, a signal that he intends to lie, manipulate, and generally behave appallingly. Marlowe's Machiavel speaks the prologue to the Jew of Malta with magnificent self-satisfaction. Shakespeare's Richard III and Iago bear the hallmarks of the stage Machiavel. This stock character bears essentially no relationship to what Machiavelli actually wrote, but it is enormously influential. It shapes how most people for the next 2 centuries understand the name. There is a bitter irony here that Machiavelli himself, with his taste for irony, might have appreciated darkly. He spent his career arguing that the gap between appearances and reality is where politics happens, that the image a ruler projects and the reality of what a ruler does are 2 separate things, and that the skilled leader manages both. And then, posthumously, his own work became a perfect example of exactly this. His image as a cynical devil's advocate, the Machiavel of Elizabethan drama, bore almost no relationship to the reality of what he wrote. The man who wrote most penetratingly about the manipulation of appearances had his own appearance manipulated beyond recognition by history. If there's a ghost of Niccolò Machiavelli somewhere, it is probably experiencing this with a complicated mixture of amusement and exasperation. And yet, the Prince keeps getting read. It keeps getting found useful. Rulers who publicly condemn it have private copies. Cardinal Richelieu reads it. Frederick the Great of Prussia writes a refutation of it, called the Anti-Machiavel, and then governs, after he becomes king, in a way that would have made Machiavelli nod with recognition. The man who wrote the refutation, arguing that princes must always keep faith, must always be guided by virtue, turns out, in practice, to wage aggressive wars, partition Poland, and conduct diplomacy with precisely the strategic flexibility Machiavelli recommended. The gap between the public position and the private reality is itself the most Machiavellian thing about Frederick the Great's relationship with the prince. Napoleon reads it and annotates it extensively. Francis Bacon praises it. Spinoza praises it. Rousseau, who disagrees with almost everything in it, cannot stop writing about it. Even the people who hate the prince cannot stop talking about it, which tells you something about what it is actually doing. What it is actually doing is asking a question that human civilization cannot quite resolve and cannot quite stop asking. What is the relationship between ethics and politics? Can a political leader be both effective and moral? If they must choose, which should they choose? Machiavelli's answer, that effectiveness sometimes requires abandoning conventional morality, but that this abandonment is itself in service of a higher practical good, is not satisfying. It is not meant to be satisfying, it is meant to be honest, and honest answers to difficult questions rarely satisfy. The thinkers who engage most seriously with Machiavelli in later centuries tend to be the ones who disagree with him most passionately. Jean-Jacques Rousseau thinks Machiavelli was actually a secret Republican patriot who wrote The Prince as an exposé of tyranny, essentially that Machiavelli was being ironic the whole time. This interpretation is creative and almost certainly wrong, but it tells you how much Rousseau needs Machiavelli to be something other than what he is. Leo Strauss, the 20th century philosopher, argues that Machiavelli represents a fundamental break with the classical and Christian tradition, a new beginning of a specifically modern kind of political thought that eventually leads to both democracy and totalitarianism in different ways, because both ultimately rest on the premise that politics operates by its own rules rather than divine ones. This is a grand argument and highly debatable, but not obviously wrong. Isaiah Berlin, one of the great political philosophers of the 20th century, has a brilliant essay on Machiavelli arguing that the real radicalism is not that Machiavelli is immoral, but that he implies there are two genuinely different and irreconcilable value systems: the Christian virtues of humility, mercy, and piety, and the pagan civic virtues of strength, civic glory, and effective governance, and that choosing one means genuinely sacrificing the other. There is no synthesis. There is no answer that gets you everything. You choose, and the choice costs you something real. This vision of tragic moral conflict, the idea that life contains genuine dilemmas without clean resolutions, is, Berlin argues, Machiavelli's most lasting and disturbing contribution to human thought. Modern political science basically begins with Machiavelli, not because everyone agrees with him, but because he established the principle that politics can be studied empirically, that you can look at what actually happens, draw lessons from patterns, and make predictions. The idea that political behavior follows discoverable regularities, rather than simply the will of God or the whims of great men, is the founding assumption of modern political science. Machiavelli is where that assumption first gets articulated clearly enough to build on. Every political science department that studies state formation, every think tank that analyzes power, every analyst who treats international relations as a system governed by incentives rather than morality, they are all, in some genealogical sense, downstream of the man who sat in his farm study in 1513 and decided to write down what he had actually seen. Chapter 13. What Machiavelli actually believed. The Republican Heart. Here is the thing that most people miss about Machiavelli. Because most people read The Prince and stop there. He believed in republics. He believed, genuinely and consistently, that republican government rooted in civic participation, in citizens who have a stake in the outcome, in institutions that outlast any individual, is superior to princedoms. He says so explicitly in the discourses. He says that a republic adapts better to changing times because it can produce different leaders for different challenges. He says that the people, collectively, are a better judge of political reality than any individual prince. He says that civic virtue, the willingness of citizens to put the common good above private interest, is the bedrock of political stability. The Discourses on Livy is, in many ways, the better key to understanding Machiavelli than The Prince, precisely because it is where he works out his deepest political commitments at full length. He spends book after book of the Discourses analysing why Rome was great, and his answer is consistently institutional. Rome's greatness was not the product of brilliant individual leaders, though Rome had those. It was the product of institutions that channeled conflict into productive competition, that created checks on concentrated power, that forced even ambitious men to earn their influence through service to the common good, rather than simply seizing it. Rome had tribunes who could check the consuls. It had a senate that accumulated institutional memory across generations. It had a culture that genuinely honoured civic sacrifice, not just as rhetoric, but as practice. These things together produced a republic capable of surviving crisis after crisis, loss after loss, and eventually dominating the Mediterranean world. And then Rome lost those things, not all at once, but gradually, through a process Machiavelli traces with clinical attention. As the empire grew and the republic's citizens became wealthier and more comfortable, the willingness to sacrifice for the common good eroded. The poor became a mob susceptible to demagogues. The wealthy became an oligarchy susceptible to corruption. The generals became power brokers. The institutions that had channeled ambition into public service became instruments of private interest. And eventually, the republic gave way to the empire, and the empire gave way to the chaos of its own collapse. He looks at this story and sees Florence. He looks at Florence's endless factional squabbling, its shifting alliances, its willingness to hire mercenaries rather than trained citizens, its inability to produce the kind of civic culture that would make genuine republican government viable. And he is depressed by what he sees. He knows what a republic could be, because he has read 1,000 years of Roman history. He knows what Florence is. The gap is painful. The prince, then, is not his final word on politics. It's his word on a specific problem. What do you do when the civic virtue necessary for a republic doesn't exist? When the population has been so corrupted by faction, self-interest, and foreign domination that they cannot govern themselves? In that situation, and Machiavelli believes this describes Italy in his time, a strong leader may be necessary to impose enough order that civic virtue has a chance to re-emerge. The prince is not the ideal. The prince is the emergency measure, the medicine when ordinary remedies have failed. This distinction matters enormously. The Machiavelli who believed in republics, who wrote the discourses as a lengthy love letter to Roman civic institutions, who built a citizens' militia because he believed citizens should defend their own city. This Machiavelli is rarely quoted on motivational posters or cited by politicians trying to justify ruthlessness. But he's the more complete figure. He is a man who believed in political freedom and civic participation, who watched the institutions that embodied those values collapse, and who spent the rest of his life trying to understand why they failed and how they might be rebuilt. That is not a cynical project. That is a deeply idealistic one, expressed in the most realistic terms available. He is also, it must be said, a man of his time in ways that modern readers will find uncomfortable. His views on women are unremarkable for the Renaissance, which means they are not good. His relationship to religion is complicated. He uses religious language when it suits him. He understands that religion serves important social functions: shared values, social cohesion, the willingness to sacrifice for the common good. But his private beliefs are unclear, and his analytical distance from the church is obvious. He is not particularly interested in the spiritual lives of individuals. He is interested in institutions and their political effects. Religion, for Machiavelli, matters primarily as a tool of civic life, as something that can build or erode the willingness of citizens to act in the common good. This is a deeply unsentimental view that would have disturbed pious readers then, and remains provocative now. He also, it should be noted, was sometimes wrong. His argument that infantry is always superior to cavalry, drawn from Roman examples, was somewhat outdated by the 1500s. His assessment of the balance of power in Italy was sometimes off. His belief that his militia could stand up to professional Spanish troops proved catastrophically incorrect at Prato. He was a brilliant observer and analyst, but observation and analysis are not the same as prediction, and Machiavelli knew this better than anyone. Fortune, he kept insisting, resists calculation, even his. Chapter 14. Why He Still Matters. 500 years after his death, Niccolò Machiavelli is still being read. His works are still being taught, debated, argued over. Politicians who have never opened the prints still get called Machiavellian. His name has become so entrenched in the language as a synonym for cunning political calculation that most people who use it have no idea where it came from. Why does it persist? Partly because the questions he asks are genuinely unanswerable and genuinely inescapable. Every person who has ever had to make a difficult decision in a position of responsibility, a politician, a business leader, a military commander, even a parent, has encountered the territory Machiavelli maps. The moment when the ethical thing to do and the effective thing to do are not the same. The moment when being honest will cost you more than you can afford to lose. The moment when showing mercy will be interpreted as weakness. These are not abstract philosophical problems. They are real, recurring, painful features of human life in conditions of conflict and scarcity. Machiavelli stared at them directly, without flinching, and wrote down what he saw. That kind of clarity has a long shelf life. There's also something in him that resonates specifically with people who work inside institutions, who have dedicated themselves to a cause or a system, and then discovered, through experience, that the system does not reward dedication in the ways it should. Machiavelli spent 14 years in faithful service to the Florentine Republic. He travelled in miserable conditions, wrote detailed, honest reports, gave his best thinking, built a militia from scratch. He asked for recognition and got torture instead. His subsequent writing has the particular sharpness of a man who was not in theory opposed to idealism, but who had his idealism tested against reality in the most personal possible way and came away not broken but clarified. People who have experienced institutional betrayal, who have given their best to something that then discarded them, tend to recognize something in Machiavelli's tone. The careful, controlled anger of someone who is going to say the true thing now, because the polite thing has proven useless. Partly because he was, despite everything, a patriot. Not in the cheap sloganeering sense, but in the sense of a man who genuinely loved a place, Florence, Italy, the idea of a republic, and who watched that love fail to prevent disaster, and who kept trying anyway. There is something recognizable and moving in that. The people who refuse to stop caring about institutions and communities, even when those institutions and communities keep disappointing them, are not fools. They are the people who occasionally prevent the worst outcomes, and more often just try to, which is itself a form of grace. Consider also what Machiavelli represents in the history of secularism. He is one of the first major European political thinkers to analyze governance without placing God at the center of the analysis. This is not quite the same as being an atheist, and we have no clear evidence about Machiavelli's private beliefs, but it is a methodological secularism that is genuinely new. He looks at political history and asks, what caused this? What patterns are visible here? And he answers in terms of human psychology, institutional design, military power, and luck. Not divine will, not providence, not the reward of virtue. This way of thinking about politics as a human problem, analyzable by human means, is part of the intellectual foundation of the modern world. We are so accustomed to it that we forget it had to be established by somebody at some point. Machiavelli is part of how it got established, and there is his relationship to the idea of the state itself. Before Machiavelli, political philosophy tends to treat political communities as embedded in a larger moral and religious order. The state exists in relation to God's plan, to natural law, to the eternal moral framework within which all human life unfolds. Machiavelli does not exactly reject this framework, but he largely ignores it in his practical analysis. He treats the state as an entity with its own logic, its own survival requirements, its own modes of behaviour. The state, for Machiavelli, is something that can be studied and managed, a thing in the world with properties that can be analysed. This is one of the intellectual moves that eventually makes possible the whole tradition of international relations theory, of realism in foreign policy, of the analysis of power as a force that operates by its own rules. Every student of political science who learns about the balance of power, about deterrence theory, about the security dilemma, is building on foundations that Machiavelli helped lay, partly because he was funny and wise and human and more interesting than his reputation. The man who wrote about cruelty and deception also wrote comedies. The man who analysed fortune's indifference to human virtue also fell in love, raised children, lost jobs, made friends, played cards with people he didn't particularly like in a village tavern while wearing unsuitable shoes. He was not a symbol. He was a person, and persons in their full complexity tend to outlast the symbols we make of them. Think about what it means that the same man wrote The Prince and Mandragola. One is a hard-edged analysis of power that has disturbed and illuminated readers for 5 centuries. The other is a comedy about human desire and the elaborate, ridiculous lengths people will go to satisfy it. But look more carefully, and they are studying the same thing. Mandragola is about the gap between appearances and reality, about the willingness of people to believe what they want to believe, about how easily moral principles give way when properly motivated desire arrives at the door. The corrupt friar in Mandragola finds elaborate theological justifications for facilitating adultery, and this is exactly the dynamic Machiavelli describes in The Prince, where he notes that people judge by appearances and are easily persuaded by a ruler who knows how to appear virtuous while acting strategically. He is the same mind working the same material in different registers, serious about what is serious, delighted by the absurdity of the rest. He died in 1527, unrehabilitated, his deepest political hopes unfulfilled, his most important book not yet published. He was not, at the moment of his death, a historical figure of towering significance. He was a man of 58 who had spent his life in service to ideas and institutions that had repeatedly failed to reward him for it. He might have found this funny. He had a high tolerance for irony. He had to. He lived inside it. But here is what happened next. His books survived. They circulated. They were read by people in power and by people who thought about power. They were condemned and they kept being read. They were banned and they multiplied. The ideas proved harder to kill than the man. 5 centuries later, here we are, still arguing about what he meant, still finding his observations uncomfortably accurate, still using his name to describe the kind of political behaviour that he was the first to describe with complete honesty. He wanted to be useful. He spent his whole life wanting to be useful to Florence, to Italy, to republics, to the understanding of how power works and why it fails. He got his wish, in the most durable way imaginable, not by holding a position or winning a battle, but by writing things that are still true, still sharp, still capable of making a reader look up from the page and think, yes, that is how it actually works. I've seen that. I've felt that. I know what he means. That is not a small thing. That is not nothing. That is, by any honest measure, exactly the kind of lasting virtue that a man who spent his career thinking about virtue would have recognized and approved. Chapter 15. The World He Left Behind. Florence itself would continue its turbulent cycle for decades after Machiavelli's death. The republic that expelled the Medici in 1527, the one that failed to restore Machiavelli to his old position, was besieged by combined papal and imperial forces in 1529. After a prolonged and heroic defence, the city fell in 1530. The Medici returned again. Alessandro de' Medici became the first Duke of Florence, ending the republican tradition that Machiavelli had devoted his life to understanding and defending. Alessandro was assassinated in 1537 by a distant relative who cited tyrannicide as his motive, which is the kind of outcome that would have made Machiavelli think several paragraphs, not because he approved of political murder as a general practice, but because it illustrated once again the cyclical nature of political power that he had spent decades analysing. The Florentine Republic, the institution Machiavelli loved, the thing for which he was willing to build a militia and endure torture and write desperate job applications disguised as political philosophy, it never came back. The Medici remained in power as dukes, then Grand Dukes of Tuscany. The Republican experiment, which had been extraordinary in its ambitions and genuinely innovative in its institutions, was over. It would be, in a sense, the fate of every Italian city-state. The age of the great mercantile republics was ending. The age of consolidated monarchies and expanding empires was beginning. Machiavelli had, in his most prescient moments, understood this. He had not been able to prevent it. The world he had spent his life trying to understand and influence kept moving without him. Italy would remain a patchwork of foreign-dominated territories until the 19th century. The unified Italian nation-state he had dreamed of in the final chapter of The Prince would not exist until 1861, more than 300 years after his death. Garibaldi and Cavour, the men who actually achieved Italian unification, were not reading Machiavelli as a historical curiosity. They were reading him as a practical guide, which tells you something. In the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, his tomb is simple. The Latin inscription on the monument, added later in the 18th century, reads, "Tanto nomini nullum par elogium." For so great a name no praise is adequate. This is either a monument to a man who told the truth about power, or to a man whose name became shorthand for lying about it, depending on who's translating. He would have found that ambiguity appropriate. He spent his life in it. The books he wrote in that farm study, in those evening hours after the card games and the arguments with woodcutters, when he put on his formal robes and sat down with the ancient writers and their answers, those books outlasted the Medici, outlasted the Republic, outlasted the Italian city-state system, outlasted the Renaissance itself. They are still in print in dozens of languages, argued over in universities and government offices, and late-night conversations between people who want to understand how the world actually works. He got what he wanted, just not in the way he expected, which is itself a lesson from his own book. Closing. The legacy of the honest man. There is an argument to be made, and I want to make it here, at the end of this long journey through one remarkable life, that Niccolò Machiavelli is, paradoxically, one of the most honest figures in the history of political thought. Not honest in the sense of being personally virtuous in every dimension, but honest in the specific, costly sense of refusing to say what people wanted to hear. The comfortable story about power, the one that rulers and their advisors had been telling for centuries, is that virtue is rewarded, that good rulers thrive and bad rulers fall, that the arc of history, guided by divine providence, bends toward justice. This story is comforting. It makes the world feel fair. It makes suffering feel temporary and meaningful. Machiavelli looked at the historical record and said, "That is not what I see. What I see is that fortune is indifferent to virtue, that the good ruler and the ruthless one face the same weather, that institutions and republics that do extraordinary things can be destroyed by external pressure that has nothing to do with their internal quality, that Cesare Borgia was not defeated by his vices, but by a collision of misfortune so precise and so complete that no amount of preparation could have survived it, that the things we control, our preparation, our decisiveness, our understanding of how power actually works, are real but limited, that the things we don't control are vast, and they will win eventually in ways we cannot predict. This is not a comfortable message. It was not comfortable in 1513 when he wrote it in exile on his farm, still aching from the strappado. It is not comfortable now, but comfort is not what honest observers provide. What they provide is clarity, and clarity, even when it hurts, is more useful than comfort. Consider what his honesty cost him personally. He watched the republic he loved fall. He was tortured for something he didn't do. He was kept out of the jobs he needed and deserved. He died without seeing his most important work published. At every stage, the world had an opportunity to reward his honesty and declined. The Medici did not give him back his old position after reading The Prince. The new republic didn't either. The church put his book on the banned list. Even in his intellectual circle, his ideas were often too extreme, too willing to go where others stopped. He lived his whole life at the edge of what his society would tolerate, pushing on the boundary. And the boundary never moved for him. It moved after him. This is the particular fate of people who are right before their time, which is not the same as being ahead of their time, a phrase that implies a kind of comfortable vindication. Machiavelli was right in his time. The problem was that his time was not ready for him. The institutions around him, the church, the Republican government, even the Medici court, all had strong interests in the comfortable version of political thought, the one that said virtue is rewarded, and God watches over good rulers. Machiavelli's version, which said nothing of the sort, was unwelcome not because it was wrong, but precisely because it was right. Right at the wrong moment. Right in a context that punished rightness. He was a man who loved a republic that didn't love him back enough to keep him, who built a militia that was defeated in battle, who wrote the most famous political book in the world under his own name and never saw it published, who tried his whole life to be useful to Florence and to Italy, and to the cause of understanding how human beings organize themselves and maintain the order that makes civilization possible. He did not succeed in all the ways he wanted to. Fortune, as he knew better than anyone, rarely permits complete success. But the books survived. The ideas survived. The questions he asked about power and ethics and fortune and the gap between how we wish the world worked and how it actually works are still the questions we're asking. Still the questions that matter. Still the ones that resist every comfortable, simple answer. There is a strange beauty in the arc of it. A man dismissed and tortured, sitting in a room too small for his thoughts, dressed in formal robes that nobody saw, talking to Romans who had been dead for 1,000 years, asking them to help him understand the present, writing for an audience that, in his own lifetime, barely materialized, and then slowly, across the decades and centuries after his death, that audience arriving, growing, becoming global, the books traveling everywhere that people were serious about the question of power, the ideas finding their way into the thinking of every serious political analyst who came after, whether they acknowledged him or not. He wanted, more than anything, to be useful, to contribute to Florence, to Italy, to the great project of understanding how civilization works. He wanted to take the 14 years of experience and the lifetime of reading and translate it into something that would matter, He was denied the official role he sought. He was denied the republic he loved. But he was not denied the thing itself, the contribution, the understanding, the work that outlasts. He got that, in the form that mattered most, in the only form that 5 centuries later we can still touch. The books he wrote in that farm study, in those evening hours after the card games and the arguments with woodcutters, when he put on his formal robes and sat down with the ancient writers and their answers, those books outlasted everything that was supposed to outlast them. A man who was dismissed, tortured, exiled, and denied, who sat in a room too small for his thoughts, dressed in clothes he had no occasion to wear, talking to the dead because the living wouldn't listen, and who still, in those evening hours, managed to ask questions that 500 years of human civilization has not been able to stop wrestling with. The Prince was published in 1532 and has never been out of print. The discourses on Livy are taught in every serious political philosophy program in the world. Mandragola is performed still in theatres across Europe and the Americas, and it is still funny, which is maybe the most remarkable thing of all, that a comedy written by an exiled bureaucrat in a village outside Florence in the early 16th century can still make audiences laugh. The art of war influenced military thinking for centuries. The Florentine Histories remains a foundational text for anyone studying Renaissance Italy, and the letters, those extraordinary, honest, funny, melancholy searching letters to Vettori and the others, are read as literature in their own right, because they are literature, because Machiavelli could not write without grace, even in private correspondence, even when he was losing at cards and setting bird traps and waiting for a world that didn't seem to know it needed him. He was not Machiavellian in the way that word is usually used. He was something harder to categorize and more admirable. He was honest about the world, and he refused to stop being honest about it, even when honesty cost him everything. That is the life of Niccolò Machiavelli. That is what the name means, when you follow it all the way back to the man who carried it. Not cunning, not evil, not the devil's secretary, just a person who decided that truth was worth the trouble, and spent 58 years proving it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed tonight's journey through one of history's most fascinating and deeply misunderstood minds, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you know, and it means we get to keep making these long, immersive deep dives together. Drop a comment below telling me what surprised you most about Machiavelli, or what you already knew going in. Maybe you came in thinking he was simply the patron saint of political scheming, and you're leaving with something more complicated and more interesting than that. I hope so. I read every one of your comments, and I love hearing where these stories land for people. And if you want more long-form journeys through the lives of the people who shape the world we live in, from Caesar to Da Vinci, from Genghis Khan to tonight's man in his farm study, putting on his formal robes to talk to the ancient dead, then stay with us. There is so much more to come. Good night, and take care of yourselves.